There is a lot of talk about the indie revolution that is happening in publishing. And recently, the pot was stirred when Brandon Sanderson released a post talking about Audible. In fact, he took a bit of a shot at Audible, and I thought it'd be interesting to discuss what he had to say. But more importantly, I think there's some nuance in this conversation, some perspective from an indie author that needs to be shared. My name is Seth. I'm a full-time author who writes fantasy books and makes YouTube videos about stuff related to being an author. If that's the sort of content that you're interested in, don't forget to like and subscribe and hit the notification bell so that the next time I put out a video, you get to see it first. At the end of December, Sanderson put out a post explaining why his new books are not going to be on Audible for at least the next year and potentially a little bit longer. Andrew over at Give Reads did a really good breakdown of the whole situation. So if you want the skinny, go check out that video. I'll put a link in the description below. As I was watching that video, though, I started to think about this conversation a little bit deeper, and I realized that there's some nuance missing. There's a perspective that I haven't really heard addressed in this whole conversation. And so that's what I want to do today. The short summary of the post is that Sanderson doesn't like the fact that Audible takes 60% of the cut. They give a 40% royalty share to authors. And if you're an author who works with an audiobook publisher or you work with a royalty share split with your narrator, then you're actually only getting 20%. Because typically those deals are 50% of royalties paid out. And so that is 50% of the 40% that Audible is going to give you. So Sanderson's basic assertion here is that that's not a great deal. And he is 100% right. That is not a great deal. Especially since Audible is not actually doing any of the work. Now, that's not an entirely fair assessment, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But really, taking 60% of the royalties for sharing a digital file, you can see why people are upset. In all honesty, it's pretty terrible. But I think in all of this, there is a really important perspective that Brandon doesn't have. And in fact, that most people who are not indie authors won't have. See, Brandon has never been an indie author before. Everything that he's ever put out has been through a publishing company like Tor. He is venturing into indie publishing for the first time through this Kickstarter that he's run, an amazingly successful Kickstarter that he's run. But it has brought him into indie publishing from a different place. Now, I'm not saying that he hasn't hustled to get where he is. Even trad authors have to hustle. In fact, hustle is pretty much what separates successful authors from unsuccessful authors, whether you're trad or indie. And I'm not saying that he's wrong about Audible not being a great deal, because, again, it isn't. But to come into the indie space as the undisputed king of modern epic fantasy with a $43 million Kickstarter behind your belt does not give you the perspective of an indie author. But I'm getting ahead of myself. So let's talk about what Brandon got right in his post. First, and I've said this over and over again, it's not a great deal. So traditionally, when books were published, you would write the book, you would send it off to your publisher, they would have it printed, they would have it bound, they would have the art done, they would do all of this extra work on it, and then they would have to pay for distribution, so they would pay to ship it to people. So there were just a ton of costs in between you writing the book and somebody else getting it and being able to read it. Those costs don't exist anymore, at least in the digital space. Instead, when Amazon or when Audible publishes a book, they just put it up. And sure, they have to drive traffic to it, and sure, they have to maintain their website, but the actual cost of replicating a digital product is effectively zero. And so as they are selling this, they are not paying any of those costs that a traditional publisher would have had to pay. At the same time, they are acting as if they do. They are using the same model that a traditional publisher had to use in order to stay afloat, and they are making all of that money without the actual overhead that a traditional publisher had to carry. This is why Amazon has completely crushed the traditional publishing market. Nobody can compete with them because they're not paying all of that money for all of that distribution. To say nothing of the cost and time required to market a book. A traditional publisher would have to go through this long process of generating marketing material and then actually pushing that marketing material out and coordinating with newspapers and coordinating with anybody, influencers and anybody who's going to be helping to market the book. And they would have to do that for every single one of their titles. Amazon said, nah, I don't think we're going to do any of that. And instead just has the largest market share. So Audible pushes their content to their readers because they just have so many readers on their platform. Again, they're not paying for that. They're not paying for that marketing. That is eyes on product that they don't have to pay for. And yet they are still taking a 60% cut. That's pretty bad. I mean, it's really good for them, but it's pretty bad for the indie author who's only getting the 40%, or maybe even just half of the 40%. In fact, it's not a stretch to say that Audible is the only deal in town. They have 70 to 80% market share worldwide for audiobooks. That's insane. But it also means that there just simply isn't a place that I can go as an indie author to get the same kind of native reach. Sure, I can go to Apple and I can go to iTunes and I can go to Kobo and I can go to all of these other places. But the amount of work that I would have to do in order to sell even a fraction of the number of audiobooks as I sell on Audible on those other sites is insane. I would have to market to each and every one of them. I would have to target all sorts of different demographics to try to drive traffic to each of those. I would have to make sure my sales pages on all of those sites are together and are well built and are selling my book, as opposed to just putting it up on Audible and saying, hey, I have one place to drive traffic to. I have one place that I need to make sure looks good. The amount of time and energy it would take me as an indie author to manage all of those different sites if I went wide is exhausting. And so it's much easier to simply go with Audible because they have the audience already. Is that good though? I don't think it is. And I think that's part of what Brandon Sanderson is pointing out. And he's pointing out correctly that this is a situation where Audible has all of the power because they have all of the audience, because they have the system already built, and there really just isn't another game in town. And so they can offer a frankly poor deal to creators. So that is what Sanderson has gotten right. Now, let's talk about where the indie author perspective comes in and how it adds nuance to this conversation that I think he's missing. We just talked about how Audible has this huge audience. Guess what I don't have as an indie author? I don't have a huge audience. Guess what Brandon Sanderson, who is not an indie author, has? He has a huge audience, a gigantic audience. And he's going to bring that audience wherever he goes. It doesn't matter if he's on Audible or if he's not on Audible, he's going to bring his giant audience. But as someone who's not playing in that league, who doesn't have that audience, getting access to that kind of audience, that huge number of people who might want to read my book, is invaluable. And so in some ways, what Audible is charging for to the indie author is not simply the distribution of my book on audio format, but is instead the audience itself. Because they are making recommendations to people based on what they know that person likes. So someone who will never in a million years run across one of my books is all of a sudden going to run across it because Audible says, hey, you liked something else that was similar to this, and I want to sell you more books. So here you go. It's easy for Brandon to complain about it. It's easy for him to be like, hey, why are you taking so much money for not giving me any value? Because he's not getting the value. because the value that he gets from the audience it's already his. He already has it. But guess what? I don't. And so expecting me not to have to pay for access to a giant audience like that is actually kind of a little bit silly. So the second piece of this is one of the things we talked about earlier, the amount of time and effort it takes in order to market to all of those different platforms if I were to go wide. What Audible does by collecting everybody in one place and setting up this recommendation and marketing mechanism inside of their app is it gives me a way to optimize my marketing time and my management time so that I can write more books. At the end of the day, the thing that separates successful authors from authors who are not able to be successful is how many units they move. That's it. Like, it's nice to think that, somebody who's a great writer can just be successful. But if you can't do the marketing piece, if you can't drive traffic to your book, if you can't sell your book, I'm sorry, you can't be a full-time author. That's just not going to happen. At least not an indie author. And the reality is, and it's kind of a sad reality, I know people who are better writers than I am, who write better stories, and yet they're not full-time authors. And it's because they either can't or don't want to do the marketing piece behind it. Well, Audible came in and said, guess what? We can shortcut this for you. The amount of effort it took 10 years ago to be an indie author is mind-boggling. And the fact that people were successful with it is incredibly impressive. But Amazon and Audible have come in and they have shortened the amount of time it takes to market your book. They have decreased the friction between me and my readers. They have made it easier to distribute. They have made it easier for people to find my books. And again, expecting all of that for free or expecting to not have to pay for that is a little bit of a silly idea. And one you can have if the value you're getting from Audible isn't very high. And the reality is that Brandon Sanderson is in a position to not get that value from them. He brings his own value. He is a big enough name that he doesn't have to worry about it. His Kickstarter pre-sold $43 million worth of books. If I could sell $43 million worth of books, you can bet that I would hold the same position that he does. Hey, this isn't a great deal. And again, I'm not saying it is a good deal. I would absolutely love to get 50% or 60% or, miracle of all miracles, 70%, which is typically the industry standard for a digital product. And in fact, I think it should be even higher than that. But the reality is that as an author, while I bring the value of my creation, of my story, of my book to the platform, they're charging me for the eyes that are going to see it, for the recommendations and potential sales. I'm getting charged for all of that. And if I'm being completely honest, I think that's an okay deal, at least for where I am in the game. See, what I know from being in this industry is that Audible doesn't actually care if Brandon Sanderson puts his books on their website or not. Of course, there's somebody at Audible who's probably not going to meet their yearly KPIs because they didn't cut this deal. It's probably gotten demoted or fired or reamed out by their boss because of it. But if you read his post, you'll realize that he did not say he will never put them on Audible. He didn't say Audible has to change what they're doing in order for the books to be on that platform. No, he said he's not going to put them on for a year, maybe more. What does that mean? Well, considering that he's putting them on Spotify and considering that he's putting them on Speechify, it sounds to me like he's getting an exclusive for at least a year with those other platforms. And then guess what he's going to do? He's going to turn around and he's going to put them on Audible. And all of the sales that he has missed out on this last year because he didn't have access to that audience are going to come rolling right in. I don't want to take anything away from what Brandon Sanderson is doing. I think it's very admirable that he's using his platform to open up this discussion and shed light on a situation that could be better. Because it could. Independent creators could be getting paid more for what they're creating, for the value that they're bringing. Absolutely. But he's not going to lose a dime. And guess who can't do what he's doing? I can't. Other indie authors can't. We can't afford it because we don't have the audience that he has. I think it's incredibly important that this conversation be opened up, and I'm very grateful that he did. But as someone who lives and breathes selling books online, this feels more like a calculated move to me than an altruistic one. And don't get me wrong, if I could make a move like this, I absolutely would. But I want to know what you think about this. Do you think that Brandon is doing this out of the kindness of his heart, or is this a calculated thing? Do you think that his stand is going to have an impact? Let me know down in the comments below. Also, if you like this sort of video, don't forget to leave that thumbs up. That way I know that you want more of this kind of content.